Stefon Diggs cleared. Not guilty on every count in Dedham, and he's still out there unsigned. 5 teams calling, Peters not budging, and in a minute, I'm telling you if that's genius or the mistake that cost him. Terry McLaurin, already in full pads, looking like 2024 Mac again. But Blau's testing something that could reshape this whole offense. And up front, it's a dogfight in Ashburn. Center job still open, Coleman plugging holes, and at corner, a surprise retirement just brought back a name nobody saw coming, Raise Hale. Okay, we need to talk about this seriously because we've been circling the same topic for months, and this week something finally happened that changes the tone of the conversation. Nikki Javala of The Athletic spent just 2 days watching the Commanders' receiver room in Ashburn, and the first thing she did was name Stefon Diggs as the fix. 2 days, fam. It didn't take 3 weeks of camp for a serious reporter to start wondering out loud whether this roster needs Diggs to avoid coming up short at the most important position after quarterback. And look, I get the temptation to downplay this. Every time a receiver drops a ball on a routine drill in the middle of July, somebody on social media is going to bring up Diggs. That's just how this works. But what actually grabs my attention isn't the social media drama. It's what John Keim said on 106.7 The Fan. Keim, who's been covering this team since before most of us could pronounce Ashburn correctly, was direct about it. He doesn't see anybody else on the market who can move the needle like Diggs. His point was basically that nobody else available tempts this front office, and the guys who might come free later in the year haven't helped their own case over the last month and a half. That's information, not random podcast speculation. Now, here's the part a lot of channels are getting wrong, and I want to correct it right away because it matters for understanding why Diggs is still unsigned in August. Diggs isn't coming off some 2025 recovery year. Diggs played the full 2025 season with the New England Patriots on a 3-year, $69 million contract and posted his 7,000-yard season in 8 years. 85 catches, 1,013 yards, and 4 touchdowns across 17 games, a key piece in New England's run all the way to Super Bowl 60, where they fell 29-13 to Seattle. That's a Pro Bowl caliber receiver producing at an elite level at 32 years old. What actually complicated things happened off the field, and I'm naming it directly because this channel doesn't do euphemisms on legal matters. In December 2025, his personal chef at the time, Jamila Adams, accused him of assault during an argument over unpaid wages at his home in Massachusetts. Diggs was formally charged with felony strangulation and misdemeanor assault, pleaded not guilty at his February arraignment, and the case went to trial on May 5th, 2026 in Dedham District Court. The jury deliberated for under 2 hours and found him not guilty on both counts. That's it. Legally, this is closed. And I want to be fair here. Covering this with euphemisms, without saying what he was charged with or how it ended, would be disrespectful to Diggs and to the accuser alike. Those are the facts, period. What's interesting for us as Commanders fans is the sequence of events. New England cut Diggs this offseason, clearing over $16 million in cap space and voiding the final 2 years of his deal, while the legal case was still pending. That wasn't a performance decision. That was reputational risk management from a franchise that had just lost the Super Bowl and didn't want the distraction. And even though Diggs walked out acquitted in May, by then he'd already spent months off a roster, unsigned, training on his own. That's the real reason a receiver with 7,000-yard seasons in the last 8 is still unsigned deep into August camp. It's not that nobody wants him, it's that the market got spooked first and is only now catching up to the fact that the legal problem no longer exists. And here's my take, no filter. I think Adam Peters is playing this market a little too calm for what this roster actually needs in 2026. There's no legal cloud left, no pending trial, no NFL suspension hanging over this guy. All that's left to negotiate is price. I get the logic of waiting for that price to drop even further while the calendar eats away at Diggs' options. That's smart from a cap perspective. But there's a real risk here too. Jeremy Fowler reported at least 5 teams are already checking in on his market. 5. This isn't a guy who's gonna wait forever for Washington to make a move. And the connection with Jaden Daniels, who played together at Arizona State, is undeniable, and Diggs himself has pointed to that as part of what makes coming to the DMV appealing. If Peters lets another team move first, just to save a couple guaranteed $1 million, and then in October we're watching receiver room injuries with no reinforcement in place, that's going to be a decision that feels really bad in the season review. Let's get tactical. Because this is where I want y'all to understand why Diggs still matters at 32. His own words confirm it. He said he sees himself as a really good number 2 receiver for a top-tier quarterback. Listen to that phrase again. He didn't say superstar, he didn't say WR1, he said WR2 for a top quarterback. That's veteran self-awareness, and it's exactly the role Washington needs filled next to McLaurin. And there's another tactical angle almost nobody's discussing: how it would change David Blau's offensive design if Diggs actually shows up. Right now, without a settled WR2, Blau has to build passing concepts that lean on McLaurin winning his matchup pretty much alone, with the rest of the room functioning more as distraction than real threat. With Diggs on the field, that changes completely. Diggs understands release leverage as well as almost anybody in the league. He knows how to sell the inside break to win outside, and at his best he was a nightmare specifically against zone coverage, which is exactly the kind of defense an undercenter run heavy offense is going to see more often. That gives Blau the option to line McLaurin and Diggs up on the same side of the formation and force impossible leverage and disguised decisions on the opposing secondary, something Washington simply cannot do today with the room it has. I also want to be fair to the other side of the argument, because good analysis can't just be hype. Diggs will turn 33 during the contract he signs next, and across 3 straight seasons, with Buffalo, with Houston, and with New England, he moved on after just 1 year at each stop despite producing. That to me is a real yellow flag. Whether it's locker room fit, scheme fit, or something else entirely, no team has wanted to keep him long term for 3 years running. If Washington signs him to a contract with heavy guaranteed money banking on 3 or 4 years of production, that's a real risk, both to the cap and to the locker room. None of that disqualifies him from a short, well-structured deal in 2026, but any serious analysis has to put it on the table, instead of just selling y'all the pretty part of the story. Look, I'm not gonna lie to anybody, and I'm not gonna pretend this is a done deal, because it isn't. But if you ask me which story moves this whole season the most before week 1 kicks off, it's this one. Every practice where a young receiver blows a route, every time Antonio Williams has a rough day, every time Treylon Burks gets banged up again, this name is coming right back into the conversation and harder. And if Washington signs Diggs in the next few weeks, everybody's gonna say, bro, that it was obvious the whole time. Write that down. Okay, after talking about receiver room uncertainty, I needed this story as much as y'all did, because on Monday, in the first full pads practice of camp, Terry McLaurin didn't just show up, he looked sharp, and I'm saying that with real context behind it, not as a fan who only wants to post positive content. Let's rewind, because the context matters a ton here. In 2024, the Daniels to McLaurin connection produced 1,089 receiving yards and 13 touchdowns, combining regular season and playoffs during Washington's run to the NFC Championship game. McLaurin finished with 12 regular season touchdowns, second only to Jamar Chase across the entire league, and added 3 more in the postseason. That was the best season of his career. And then 2025 happened, and it all fell apart. A hold and over a contract dispute before the season even started, a week 3 injury that cost him 7 games, and a season that closed out with career lows, 582 yards and just 3 touchdowns. For a receiver who had been this franchise's most reliable constant for 8 years straight, that season hurt. And here's my take, even though I know some of y'all won't love it, that 2025 hold-in was unnecessary and partly on the front office. McLaurin had been producing like a true number 1 for 2 straight years on a contract that had fallen way behind the market, and the organization waited too long to sit down and renegotiate in good faith. I'm not saying McLaurin was right about everything. Hold-ins always create friction that didn't need to exist. But when your best offensive player has to publicly pressure you to get what he already earned on the field, that's a relationship management failure, not just tough negotiating. That's why what happened this week in Ashburn matters so much. McLaurin spoke directly about his relationship with Daniels, and it wasn't the usual locker room cliche. He said the two of them are texting back and forth off the field, building a connection that goes beyond roots drawn up on a whiteboard. And he added something that, as an analyst, I think is key. He said Daniels keeps growing as a leader, that his more vocal side is showing up more and more, and that when Daniels talks, the room listens. That's quarterback leadership maturing in real time, and it's exactly what this offense needs if it's going to survive a system change with David Blau as the new coordinator. And speaking of Blau, here's the tactical detail that has me legitimately excited. McLaurin has been taking slot snaps this week of camp. This isn't a cosmetic move. Blau is installing an offense built around under-center snaps, zone run concepts, and play action, a scheme that worked wonders in Detroit using a similarly built receiver, Amon-Ra St. Brown, as a multi-position weapon out of the slot. McLaurin isn't going to be a full-time slot receiver. Let's be clear about that because Antonio Williams and even Luke McCaffrey are also going to rotate through there. But just the possibility of moving McLaurin between the outside and the interior makes this offense a lot harder for opposing defenses to read. That's pure matchup hunting. You put your best player where the opponent has the weakest defender, and you force the defensive coordinator into uncomfortable decisions before the snap. Now, my honest take on the ceiling here. McLaurin is 31 years old. He's not a player who's going to get younger by magic. But elite football isn't always about pure speed. It's about leverage, about timing, about knowing exactly when to break on a route so the defender is a step behind. That doesn't disappear at 31, that gets refined. And if Blau genuinely uses that positional versatility the way the reports are suggesting, I wouldn't be shocked if McLaurin closes this season with career highs in catches and total yards. Something that would sound crazy for a receiver his age if we hadn't already seen him do something close to it in 2024. There's a real concern I'm not going to hide. Health. McLaurin is coming off a season where an injury cost him 7 games, and his style of play, with precise routes and aggressive breaks, depends on his body holding up week after week. That's something worth monitoring through the rest of camp and preseason, not something to pretend doesn't exist. But if he gets to week 1 healthy with this renewed chemistry with Daniels and this new flexibility in Blau's scheme, fam, we're talking about a receiver who can be top 5 in the conference again. And honestly, after the season we had in 2025, we needed this kind of news. There's another layer worth digging into here, and it's the symbolic weight of McLaurin coming back with 0 contract drama this year. In 2025, the hold-in ate up entire weeks of camp, mental energy, awkward interviews, speculation that the marriage between player and franchise was cracking. This year, none of that. McLaurin showed up, put on the full pads, and went straight to work. That's not a small detail for a locker room that needs stability after the year they had. When your number 1 wide receiver, the guy with more tenure in the building than almost any other starter, shows up with 0 friction and then produces on day 1 of pads, that sends a signal to the rest of the roster that 2026 feels different. Young players notice that, and in a locker room coming off a hard year, that kind of quiet leadership matters just as much as any stat line. To close things out, let's cover 2 roster stories that don't have the glamour of Diggs or McLaurin, but that will absolutely shape what this team looks like on day 1 of the regular season. And honestly, the first one leaves me pretty skeptical of the front office. Let's start with the offensive line. Adam Peters cut Tyler Biadasz this offseason, a center who had started 31 games over the last 2 seasons. That was a reasonable call at the time. Biadasz wasn't an elite player at the position. The problem is what came after. Here we are in August in the first week of full pads, and the Commanders still haven't settled who the starting center is going to be. Nick Allegretti enters as the nominal favorite, but he left practice early on August 1st for a reason the team hasn't fully explained, and he's now directly competing with Julian Good-Jones and Matt Golban for the job. And on top of that, the team started putting Brandon Coleman, who's already fighting for the left guard spot, in at center for emergency snaps. John Keim reported it directly. If Allegretti is going to be out a week or more, they need another option, and they might need it later in the season too. Look, I'm gonna be critical here because, bro, I think they've earned it. This is an offensive line protecting Jaden Daniels, the single most important asset this franchise has. And we've reached August without 2 of the 5 spots settled. And before I go further, let me correct myself on something that gets repeated a lot online. Chris Paul's modest $3 million one-year deal isn't a sign the front office doubted him. Paul had a real outside market, projected between 12 and 15 million a year according to SpotRack and Over the Cap, and he won the starting job during the 2025 regular season over Coleman. He chose to come back to Washington for a lot less money because he wanted to stay next to Laramie Tunsil in a system he already knows. That's player loyalty, not a lack of confidence from Peters. That said, here's my real criticism. Left guard is still an open competition between Paul and Coleman, even though Paul earned the job outright in 2025. And combined with a center spot that's completely unresolved, that tells me this offensive line planning has been more reactive than I'd like to see from a front office with Adam Peters' reputation. When you've got 2 offensive line spots unresolved in front of a quarterback we just watched get hurt, the margin for error shrinks quite a bit. The one real silver lining here is that Coleman, according to the coaches themselves, can play all 5 spots on the line, which gives Dan Quinn emergency flexibility if something goes wrong. But emergency flexibility isn't the same thing as a clear plan, and this franchise needs clarity up front if it wants to protect Daniels for a full 16-game season. Now, the other story, which landed as a total surprise this Tuesday, veteran cornerback Ahkello Witherspoon, who had signed with Washington back in March, was placed on the reserve retired list. A surprise retirement without much warning beforehand. And in the same move, the team signed a name that's going to spark instant nostalgia among fans who've been following this for nearly a decade: Fabian Moreau. Moreau was a Washington 3rd-round pick, number 81 overall, in the 2017 draft, back in the era of Bruce Allen as general manager and president and Jay Gruden as head coach. That version of Washington doesn't even exist anymore, and honestly, bro, it's a completely different franchise. What can Moreau realistically bring in 2026? Honestly, not a whole lot more than emergency depth. It's been several years since he left Washington's roster, and his recent production around the league hasn't been that of a consistent starter on a contending team. But he does know the Washington market, presumably knows part of the organization's culture, and he's arriving at a moment when the team needs bodies with real NFL snap experience to fill out the camp roster. This isn't a signing that changes the season's fate, and it would be dishonest of me to sell it as one. It's at best a reasonable patch while Trey Amos continues his recovery process, and Mike Sainristil looks to lock down the perimeter corner job. At worst, it's a sign that the depth behind the starters in this secondary is still thinner than Dan Quinn would like to admit in public. My honest take is that this signing on its own doesn't worry me, but it does raise an eyebrow about the broader planning at the position. If the best available depth option at this point in the year is a guy who was off Washington's roster almost a decade ago, that tells me the cornerback draft class and free agency haul came up short this offseason. That's a direct criticism of how this position group was built, not a shot at Moreau, who's just doing his job. And there you have it, fam. A camp day with a little bit of everything. Real uncertainty at receiver that's got us all waiting on DIGGS. A huge injection of hope with Terry McLaurin looking like the Terry we've always known alongside a Jaden Daniels who keeps maturing as a leader. And roster moves that remind us a 53-man roster gets built through big and small decisions every single day, not just the names that make headlines. This franchise is coming off a week 1 where all of us are hoping it confirms 2025 was the exception and not the new normal. And honestly, between a healthy McLaurin, a maturing Daniels, and the real possibility of adding DIGGS before the season kicks off, there's plenty of reason to believe that bounce back is on its way. If this video gave you something real, drop a like, subscribe, and tell me down in the comments. Would you sign DIGGS today even if it means overpaying, or would you wait and see if the house already has what it needs? See you in the next one. Burgundy and gold, always.